In the past lessons, this is the last, by the way, this is the last of what we'd call the historical setup for studying the life of Christ. Starting next week, we actually get into the life of Christ. Part 1 is next week. So we want to finish today. While we've looked in the past at the political circumstances and the social circumstances of before Christ arrived, now today we want to look at the physical environment. Okay? Many of us know, most of us should recognize that the word Palestine is an all-inclusive term for the area in which Jesus was born into as well as he ministered. Now, if you will look at the map, look at the large map, this large map, the country of Palestine in Jesus' time was much larger than it is today. Forget about the political setup of the Far East today, because Palestine is a much smaller area. But in terms of the Palestine that Jesus was born into, we need to think back about our studies in the Minor Prophets and about the scope of the area that the nation of Israel, both nations, the nation of Israel as well as the nation of Judah, kingdom of Judah, occupied when they were around. And so if you look at your map, if you go up to the top, up toward the top, close to, well, look for Galilee, okay? Galilee was the northern province of the country of Palestine when Jesus was born. Now, if you think back to the Old Testament times, that was the area where Manasseh and Dan settled into. So the country of Palestine stretched all the way from the north, all the way down to the south, to the province of Judea, which went all the way as far south as the city of Beersheba, which you will see just underneath the province of Idumea. Okay? So you have a fairly substantial distance involved in what was determined, in what we determine as Jesus' ministry area. It was about 150 miles long. It covered about 10,000 to 12,000 square miles. And it occupies an area which is about, 40 of our 50 U.S. states are larger than this. So while it looks like a big area, in the big scope of things, it was fairly small area. And there was obviously a reason for that, which we will discuss here in a few minutes when we take a look at this. So look, think of the country of Palestine as that area of the Old Testament times of the nation, the combined nation of Israel. And then your other map, you can kind of take that and lay that on top, and you can kind of see how those provinces were made up. And these are the three main provinces or areas that the Jews primarily occupied and that Jesus primarily ministered in. Although he spent the majority of his time, we will find out, up in the Galilean area, and there's a reason for that. Okay? Now, it is true that he didn't just minister just in the area of the Jews, but he did from time to time, and we'll take a look at some of those, he did venture over east of the Jordan, when you look at the big map, into areas that we call Decapolis. That's just simply a word that means 10 cities, okay? And that's referenced in the New Testament. I wrote for you, before I ran off the map, the scriptural references, some of the scriptural references for each of those areas. We've got the Decapolis, the 10 cities. We've got the nation of, or the area of Perea, which is farther down to the south. Up at just east of Galilee was an area called the Bashan District, or the Bashan District. Okay? Jesus also ministered in those areas. So he didn't just confine himself to the primary nation or the area of Palestine, but rather the scope of his ministry and where he traveled stretched out into areas also that were not typically thought of as the main Palestinian area. Although if you stop and think about it, remember, we had Jews that were settling. Remember, they settled on the east side of the Jordan too. So there were still Jews that he went to that were still over east of the Jordan. Because when after the Babylonian captivity and the other captivities that the Israelites and the Judeans went through, when they were resettled into the country, remember that there was a remnant that had not gone into captivity. They had escaped captivity in one way or another by either leaving the area, so they weren't part of the capture, or in other means they were able to keep themselves in areas that were also east of the Jordan. And so Jesus was still ministering primarily to the Jews, and there was a reason for that, of course, which we will discuss. So think of the primary provinces of Jesus' ministry as Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. And while the Jews dominated Judea, remember that the Samaritans dominated Samaria. Now, recall back in our Old Testament teaching, who were the Samaritans? Why were they looked down upon by the Jewish people? What were the Samaritans? They were mixed breed. That's right. They were mixed breed, remember? They had not only married into some of the people that were in that area when they moved into it, but remember, after the Babylonian captivity, the Babylonian king started moving his own people back into the area along with the Jews, and so some of that intermarriage took place. And so these people were considered to be half Jews, and were, for the most part, generally speaking, looked down upon by the pure, for lack of any other term, pure Jewish people. Okay? Now, to the south, we have Judea. Okay, that was primarily, as we said, the Jews. Up farthest part north was the area of Galilee. Now, who were the people of the Galilean region? Do we recall? They were not only Jews, but there were Gentiles. Okay? So the area of Galilee had both Jews and Gentiles living in that region. Maybe that's why Jesus spent a lot of his time, much of his time, up in that region, even though his primary ministry was, of course, to the Jews. But they were the most northernmost part of Palestine. Now, again, to the Orthodox, for lack of any other term, the Orthodox Jews of that time, they were not necessarily regarded very highly by the Jewish people, because they thought they were kind of backward. Because for the most part, the region of Galilee, a lot of the people stuck pretty close to old traditional times rather than bringing themselves up to date, so to speak, with some of the changes that the Jews had gone through in their life. And then, as we said, other areas on your map that Jesus spent some of his time in was the Bashan District, Decapolis, and Perea. So that kind of gives you the scope of the area, of the region in which Jesus ministered. Now, there were also some changes that had taken place in how people designated or how people referred to what was known as the Israelites. By the end of the Old Testament, they were already referred to as Jews. Now, where did that term Jews come from? From the nation of Judah, okay? And that's because, for the most part, the largest, for lack of any other term, settlement of the Israelites was in Judah. And so people knew most of the Israelites by their presence in the area which is Judea on our map, but the nation of Judah. So that name Jew was perhaps it could have been derogatory at some point, but they just became known as Jews or the Jewish people, even by the time of Old Testament. Now, when we get up to the New Testament, that's their primary designation. They are referred to sometimes by other terms like Israelites. They were still called Israelites in some cases. John 1:47 and 2 Corinthians 11:22 uses that term. They were also called Hebrews because of the language. Okay? So we have a triple designation of the same people: Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews. Now, who do we know from our New Testament studies referred to, and I'm not going to give it away, but referred to, this person referred to itself as all three of those? Who? Paul, absolutely. Paul, okay? In Paul's ministry and in his dealing, remember, with the Roman government and with the people of that area, he always he said, look, I am Hebrew, okay? I'm a seed of Abraham. I'm from the seed of Abraham. I am a Jew. Why? Because he was from the tribe of what? Not Judah. Benjamin, which, remember, was part of the nation of Judah, because you had Judah and Benjamin who made up the nation of Judah. So he considered himself, and he referred to himself as all three: a Hebrew, an Israelite, and a Jew. Now, you can check that 2 Corinthians 11:22 and Philippians, the 3rd chapter, 4 through 6. Between those two verses, and there's others, but between those two verses, you will see Paul refer to himself, refer to himself as a Hebrew, an Israelite, and a Jew. And those are the three terms that we need to remember as the designation throughout the New Testament for the people that were heretofore known as God's people, as the Israelites. And so when you hear the term Hebrew people, Jewish people, or Israelites, we are referring to the same people in the Bible. Now, there were also some changes that had taken place in the language of the people. By the time, actually, as after the Babylonian captivity, there was a language, a Syrian language, that began replacing Hebrew among the people. In fact, if you remember from our studies in the Minor Prophets that we just finished, there was a few times when the Minor Prophets referred to the fact that some of the law and some of the scriptures had to be explained to some of the younger Israelites because they didn't understand the Hebrew language, because they had become so accustomed to the Aramaic. Now, the Aramaic is actually a Syrian, came from the country of Syria. Now, but it is similar to Hebrew. Syrian, or the Aramaic, is similar to Hebrew in the same way that Italian is similar to Latin, okay? Because the languages were derived from the. Now, in New Testament times, so we know again from last week, I remember we covered this, the universal language in the area was Greek. That was the spoken language. That was the understood language by most of the people in the area. And why was the Greek language so pervasive in this area? Alexander the Great. Remember Alexander the Macedonian, or the Macedonian Great? All those refer to the same conqueror. When he conquered this area, he brought with him the language and the culture and the philosophy of Greece. And so this was very prevalent here in this region. However, the official language, because they were under the Roman Empire rule, the official language of the Roman Empire was, of course, Latin. Okay? So, in fact, what's the single indication in the New Testament that these three languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, were all the prevailing languages of that area at the cross of Jesus? Okay? Turn to John 19, verses 19 and 20. John 19, verses 19 and 20. Actually, in earlier verses 17 and 18, so he was on the cross. That's where they crucified him. Two others, of course, with him. And then verse 19, now Pilate wrote a title, and he put it on the cross. The writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Pilate accepted that he was the King of the Jews. He didn't have any problem doing that because the Jews were still under his control. But it's interesting to note that he wrote it in all three languages. Many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and this title was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. So all three of those languages were used in various parts of the Roman Empire, although the most common language that was used was the Greek language. Okay? Any questions, any clarification so far? Okay, now let's talk about the lifestyle or the occupation for a minute about the Jewish people. I'm just going to keep referring to them as the Jewish people. Before captivity, what were the Jewish people? Primarily farmers and herdsmen, okay? Had lots of flocks, lots of cattle, okay? Now, during the captivity, though, they didn't have this same lifestyle, so they discovered, I don't think it was a sudden thing, but they finally realized that they had other talents within their people. What was that? What's that? Managing money. They were good tradesmen, but they were also, had other skills. So they had developed different lifestyles so that they didn't all have to be farmers or herdsmen, but they could also work in the trades, and they were great in business situations. Okay, I won't think about any stereotype. Okay, we're not going there. The point is that they were great tradesmen and great businessmen. In fact, during New Testament times, Jewish businessmen were scattered all over the world by that time. Okay? Now, there were also some changes that took place in their worship practices as well as their location in terms of their worship. Now, remember that in the Old Testament times, what was the primary place of worship for God's people? Was the temple. In fact, the law required them to do certain things where they had to be at the temple to do it. Of course, led by the priests and especially the high priest. But remember, by the New Testament times, the temple was in disarray. Okay? It had was in a destroyed situation by the time Jesus arrived on the scene. Okay? Remember that Solomon's temple, the temple that Solomon built, had been destroyed by what nation? The Babylonians, okay, under Nebuchadnezzar, okay? And that was around 586 BC during that conquest. And then who rebuilt that temple when he came back from captivity? Remember, he led a group of people back from captivity? Zerubbabel, that's right. Zerubbabel was responsible for rebuilding the temple. And you can read that in Ezra, the 3rd through the 6th chapter, discusses the beginning and the middle. Remember, it had to be halted for a while because a group of them, who was anybody remember who was basically saying, wait a minute, when they heard about the Jewish people rebuilding the temple, who was it that put up a fuss about it? And so it had to be halted for a little bit. Okay? What's that? Well, part of them were Samaritans, okay? And then the Samaritans wanted to be involved in the finishing of the rebuilding after it was begun again, and the Jewish people said, no, that's all right, we'll do it ourselves, okay? So it was finally finished. It took about 2 years to build it, even though it was stretched out over about a 5 to 6 year period. And again, Ezra 3 through 6 will cover that area. And that was about the time frame of 521 to 516 BC. Now, in New Testament time, who was responsible for initiating the rebuilding of the temple? He was a Roman governor. Roman what? Who? Herod the Great. That's right. Herod the Great was responsible for the beginning of the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, and that took place about 16 years before Jesus was born. Construction of the temple was actually continued throughout Jesus' life. It was never completed by the time of Jesus' crucifixion. And then, in about AD 70, it was destroyed again. It was finally finished around AD 60, okay? Officially, so that they were able to fully use the temple for their worship. My wife always gets after me because she says I sometimes sound like I'm saying warship, okay? No, it's not a warship, it's worship, okay? But the point being is that even though it was officially rebuilt by AD 60, many people believe that it was still, the construction actually hadn't completely finished by the time it was destroyed again by Rome in AD 70. Now, by the time of Christ, and this actually began during the captivity, during previous times, there was a replacement of the temple as the primary place of worship by the use of synagogues. Synagogues were set up in the local areas, all the communities where the Jewish people lived. Where do we get this word synagogue? Well, there's a variety of words that support the word synagogue. The word synagogue literally means a house of assembly. That's its literal meaning, regardless of the derivation. There is a Greek word, synagogue, okay, which means a place of assembly. There's also a Hebrew word, knesset, which means assembly, just assembly. And then there's also a Greek word, the ag part of the Greek word means to move to or to be led to. And so what you get is this combination of languages that mean we're going to move to assembly, we're going to move to a house of assembly, we're going to assemble together to do something, whatever that is. And in the case of the synagogue here for the Jewish people, it was to come together or to move together, to assemble, to worship God. Synagogues were very prevalent, as we said, earlier times in the New Testament, but as the New Testament arrived, they were very prevalent. In fact, it said that it only took about 10 Jewish men to organize a synagogue. And so were many of them scattered throughout the areas where the Jews lived. Now, what did the worship in synagogues consist of? Was it the same as in the temple? A little bit. Remember, in the temple, there was the reading of Scripture, there was the teaching of Scripture, but there was one main difference in the worship that was conducted in the temple versus in the synagogue. What was that main difference? Yes, prayers were said in both. The songs, okay? The songs. History records that there was no movement of the musical instruments used in the temple into the synagogues. In fact, if you do a study of singing or music in worship, you look at the history of it, the first century Christians never had a debate about whether or not they should be using musical instruments. Why was that? Because they weren't in the synagogues. They were never in the synagogues, so they were quite used to just singing with the voice, okay? And so, in fact, where does the term a cappella come from? It's a Latin or Italian word. Where does it come from, and what does it mean? It comes from the way of the chapel or the way of the church. And it always defines it as non-accompanied voice music. Okay? Excuse me, no instruments of music at all in a cappella music. And so that was the dominant forms of worship in the synagogue. Songs, prayers, the reading of scriptures, and scripture studies. So does that give you a clue as to maybe what the pattern of our New Testament worship should be? Because did Jesus ever change that? He never changed it. Never changed it, nor did the apostles. Gave no direction at all. In fact, they emphasized the fact that we were to do what? To sing and make melody in our heart. And that's why, if you just stop and think about it from a logical standpoint, it only makes sense that we do nothing but a cappella singing in the worship. Okay, any questions or clarification about that? Okay, now let's look at changes in the religious leadership. Who were the primary religious authorities in Old Testament times for the Israelites? The priests, okay? The priests were the primary religious authority for the Old Testament people. During Jesus' ministry, Judaism had two priests. This is in Luke 3:2, by the way. There was the high priest Annas. Okay? What happened to the high priest Annas? Yeah, the Roman emperor had him removed. Okay? And who became the high priest then? Caiaphas, okay? And that's why in the New Testament Gospels, you will see the reference to Caiaphas, the high priest, but you'll also see Annas. Because for the Jewish people, even though Annas was removed by the Roman, he was still influential to the Jewish people. They still considered him to be a high priest. By the way, Caiaphas was Annas' son-in-law. Okay? That's in John 18:13, where you'll see that. Okay. And so during the New Testament times now, we have other religious leaders or other religious authorities who came into being. One of these was in fact, Jesus during Jesus' time, he was referred to as this, rabbi, okay? Rabbi. This is in, now, what the rabbis did was they were responsible for teaching in the synagogue, but remember, for the Jewish people, schools were also held in the synagogues, okay? So the rabbis became the teachers in both the synagogues and in the schools of the religion of Judaism. And so the rabbis largely replaced the priests as the religious authority. And then we have the infamous Scribes and Pharisees, primarily, okay? Now, the word scribe, the root word that we translate into scribe, means simply writer. They were responsible originally for recording important events. And that was their primary role, especially during Old Testament times. During New Testament times, what was their primary responsibility, or what was a very important responsibility that they were given? There would certainly be scribes that would be recording, okay, the collection, but they were primarily responsible for translating the Old Testament into the New Testament Greek, so that everybody would understand the Old Testament. And so scribes were given that primary responsibility. They were sometimes referred to as lawyers. If you look in Luke 7:30 and other places, you'll see them referred to as lawyers, and that's because they were known to be experts in the law. However, their expertise had nothing to do with civil or criminal law. It was strictly about the religious law. And then, of course, many of the scribes were also what? Sect Pharisees, okay? Many scribes were also Pharisees. Okay, and then you had a council or a court that came into prevalence, and the word is Sanhedrin. That's how it's referred to in at least one version extensively. The NIV, refers to it as the Sanhedrin. In many other versions, and most of the other versions, it's referred to simply as the council. For the Jewish people, the Sanhedrin was, you could look at it as the Jewish Supreme Court. They were the ultimate highest authority in all religious matters. Traditionally, it had 70 members, and it began around 200 BC. So by the time the New Testament times and the Gospels open up, the Sanhedrin was very emplaced in the life and the religious authority of the Jewish people. The president of that council was always who? The high priest. He was always the council. Now, interestingly enough, what was the majority? What sect or what group made up the majority of that council? The Sadducees. Okay? But even though the Pharisees had the minority membership, quote unquote, in the council, they still were, however, very influential as a minority. But the Sadducees did make up the majority of the council. Now, here's the important point about all these leadership groups. You probably know what it is. What was most important to all those leadership groups? Status. Maintaining their position of authority. And that's why Jesus became their enemy, because he was always speaking to that issue, okay? Which we'll talk more about. But the most important thing for all of these groups, especially the Pharisees and the scribes, Jesus spoke to them as one group. The Sadducees, all of them, their most important thought in their mind was maintaining their status, maintaining their authority. Now, we're going to go over in about a few minutes, we're going to go over one more section, and then we will have to finish up on Wednesday night because we don't have enough time to get through all of this material. There was a rise of sectarianism that came into being. There were many sects, S-E-C-T-S, folks. That's what I'm trying to say. Sects, it's hard to say, okay? That came up in and were prominent during Jesus' time. But most of these were influenced by politics and culture, very little by religion. Now, the main sect was, of course, the Pharisees. It comes from a Hebrew word, parushim, which means to separate. Most believe that they actually existed during the Seleucid, which would be the Syrian and Persian times, and that's when they tried to make Jews Greeks. Okay? During Jesus' day, they became a group of self-righteous formalism. That was their modus operandi, so to speak. They were very self-righteous. They knew the law. They were the experts in the law, and they considered themselves beyond reproach in terms of carrying out the law and telling others what they ought to be doing instead of perhaps actually doing it themselves. Matthew, the 23rd chapter, will talk a lot about, in fact, Jesus talked very much about their self-righteous attitude. While they were small in number, they did have, of course, great influence, and they were very popular among the Jewish people. Now, there was another thing that came up among the Pharisees, which they considered to be very important, and that was a writings of what they referred to as the tradition of the elders. And in fact, today, there for the Orthodox Jewish people, and perhaps even for some of the what they call the Reformed Jewish people, the difference between the Orthodox Jews and the Reformed Jews is what? If it's pretty hard to be an Orthodox Jew today. For one thing, if you say you're an Orthodox Jew, you got to make a trip to Jerusalem, okay? During especially the Day of Atonement, okay? But the point, so a lot of the Jewish religion has modified its requirements so that they're able to still participate as Jewish, the religion of Judaism here in other parts of the world. But the point being is that through the time, the Jewish people have been guided by writings that were uninspired. They did not come from God. And one of those was called the tradition of the elders. And this is where the elders would write down what they felt to be the most important aspects of both the law and in terms of carrying out the law in the lifestyle, the religious practices of the Jewish people. Well, the Pharisees used that tradition of the elders. I think it's called the Talmud, okay, which is basically the teachings of the rabbi, okay, in today's world. But they were very adamant that it was as binding as the law itself. And so they used the tradition of the elders as a very important part of their ministry to the Jewish people. And in fact, it got Jesus in trouble with the Pharisees when he dismissed the traditions. Matthew, the 15th chapter, very interesting. Read that chapter, the first 14 verses, because Jesus just rips the Pharisees about using something other than what God has provided to them. Now, there was also the Sadducees. The Sadducees were basically a wealthy, aristocratic group. Many of them were priests. However, their priest lineage started back in the Old Testament times and was derived from the high priestly line under Solomon. And the priest's name was Zadok, Z-A-D-O-K. That's where people believe that the Sadducees originated from. Although they originated about the same time as the Pharisees, they accepted Greek ways. And because they accepted Greek ways, they quite often would cooperate with the local authorities, so they became more positive to whatever the ruling government was. And because of that, they started adapting their Judaism practices to the Greek ways, to the Greek religion and philosophy. And as a result of that, they rejected the concept of what? Primarily, the resurrection. Okay? Because they adapted the Greek philosophy and religion, they rejected the concepts of resurrection, life after death, angels, or spirits. Read about that in Mark the 12th chapter and in Acts the 23rd chapter. And so they hated Jesus because he what? Threatened their authority. Jesus was an enemy of all of these ruling groups because he was a threat to their authority, because he was carrying the authority of God, who was supposed to be their almighty God also, but they had, they of course were not too keen on what Jesus was speaking about. Now, there were three other sects, which we'll finish up by going over Wednesday, and then we'll talk about the messianic expectations, and then we'll go into our questions on Wednesday night. But there were the Herodians, the Zealots, and the Essenes, okay, which we'll talk about on Wednesday night. But Herodians, primarily, they were dedicated to keeping Herod on the throne. The Zealots were about overcoming Rome with a sword. They still wanted to see Rome overcome. By the way, there was an apostle that was a zealot. Do you remember who it was? Which one it was? Simon. Okay, Simon the zealot became an apostle. And the Essenes, while they're not mentioned in the Bible, they are historical people. Do you know who was considered, who was likely part of the Essenes that we got a whole lot of archaeological findings about the scriptures from? Remember the Qumran community? Qumran. Qumran people were believed to be Essenes, okay, from the famed Dead Sea Scrolls. So we'll finish up on Wednesday night and go over the questions at that time. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.